Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy.
We're looking at TikTok. We have some very big news on TikTok. I'm on TikTok now. I know a lot of it on TikTok. I'm now a big star on TikTok. We'll take a look at TikTok. We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok. We're not doing anything with TikTok. Joe Biden is responsible for banning TikTok. If people want to save TikTok, they have to vote for me. I could have banned TikTok. I'm the one that says we should save TikTok. TikTok. TikTok, 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 Kid Rock.
Well, that was obviously Donald Trump. One of the things in that little clip demonstrated that he was for the TikTok ban before he was against it. We're going to get to that in a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com. and our post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So the Supreme Court today upheld the bipartisan ban on TikTok. The order was given to ByteDance, TikTok's owner, to sell, divest by Sunday, and we're going to see what happens. It's going to be real interesting. I know you have a lot of views on this, Matt. You're busting at the seams. So what do you think is going to happen by Sunday?
Well, I mean, clearly it's a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And I think unless the Biden administration does something, which there is a rumor that they might do some sort of delay for Trump to be able to have an opportunity to do his own delay, it'll probably get banned. I think this was the most colossal mistake the Democrats did to get on board with this. It was a phenomenal overreach. And I actually think if they had gotten behind TikTok instead of getting on the bandwagon of this stupid ban, it could have actually helped us win the election.
It's a very complicated issue. But making it even more complicated is Donald Trump, yet again, has no core values, right? For how long he keeps telling us that, China's the root of all evil in this country. He was against TikTok, wanted to ban TikTok, but then his team got him on TikTok before the election, and he did very well with it, and TikTok, in some ways, helped him get elected. So, of course, Donald Trump is now for TikTok, because it's not about the country. It's not about our democracy or protecting Americans' data. It's about what does it do for Donald Trump? It's just same old, same old. So in addition to Biden, come Monday, Donald Trump could just say, I don't give a shit what the Supreme Court said. We're not going to, my DOJ is not going to honor this. If the president can certify that there's been good faith negotiations to resolve this, then that's a trigger that could be pulled to put a pause on this. And then there's also an option of a congressional repeal, which is very unlikely. But so there's like three options for how this can go. And depending upon who you listen to, TikTok is either shutting down on Sunday or this can's getting kicked down the road.
Yeah, I think what will happen Sunday, if nothing happens before then, is Apple and Google will pull it from the stores because they're liable for violation, and they're corporations that are huge and they're not going to want to be liable. That doesn't shut them down, but it could delay, and then hypothetically on Monday at 12:01 p.m., Trump could issue an executive order extending TikTok's deadline for negotiation, 90 days, 180 days or something. And I think that what I just described is possibly the most likely scenario.
Well, it all depends on the fear that the third-party ISPs have, Google and Apple. If they feel like they can somehow be held liable criminally if they don't take the app off.
Unanimous decision, they're going to pull the plug. But
Absolutely.
That doesn't kill the app. It just, for that moment, if you don't have the app on your phone, you can't download it.
It's right. For new users, they would not be able to download. But if you already use it, right. Somebody on TV today equated it to you can have an old car, you can drive it, but you can't get new tires, you can't get this, you can't get that. Right. You might not be able to buy gas, But then also China could just say, hey, fuck you, America. And when people go on TikTok on Sunday, a big black screen can come up saying, sorry, we're done.
Sure. I mean, China's going to play politics with it. Mm-hmm. They're playing politics with a lot of other things. And I just think it's more than likely that something will work out where they will at least have a reprieve come Monday.
And the other thing, too, is guess who's coming to the inauguration as Trump's guest on Monday?
Special guest.
Right? Zi Chu,
Yep.
CEO of TikTok.
Of course.
And who did Donald Trump just have a nice friendly chat with on the phone? Gee.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that.
So who the hell knows what's going to happen? The other thing that we should talk about just briefly is these hearings this week, these Senate confirmation hearings. I watched, I don't know if you guys watched, but I watched Pete Hegseth, I watched Pam Bondi. I don't think Democrats did a good job.
Well, I did want to talk about that a little bit. For a party that has such smart people, why was there no strategy? Why is it that everyone had to point out his obvious failings and incompetencies? Where was the strategy to allow him to just be incompetent? Ask him about foreign policy. Ask him about his what, where, how, when about China. It was so fucking frustrating to watch the incompetence on Democrats.
Yeah, I think they were so focused on, in the case of Pete Hegseth, for example, on his flaws, which are innumerable. I mean, he's an alcoholic, he's a sexual offender probably. And to Jen's point, what they should have focused on is his incompetence and his inability to do the job. Not just because he's an alcoholic, but because he couldn't identify. I mean, one set of questions did at least focus on could he identify certain countries in Southeast Asia, and he couldn't. And they should have hammered home one time after another how he has absolutely no knowledge of foreign policy. His knowledge of foreign policy is based on a Fox News analysis.
Yeah, I don't want to make a sweeping judgment that nobody did anything right. There was a couple of people, Mazie.
Senator Mazie.
Hirono. I think Tim Kaine did a pretty good job because he approached it like a lawyer. Question. And Hegseth's answers for every one of them was smear.
Yeah.
If I said to you, have you cheated on your spouse and then beat up a child after on the way home? And your answer is smear.
Also, you asked
the
for...
answer should be no.
Well,
no
also,
fucking way.
He stated yes or no. Just yes or no.
Yeah. So, Jen, the answer to your question, in my opinion, is that Democrats constantly want to be above it all. They, despite getting kicked in the nuts for the last several decades by Republicans, they still somehow wake up every morning with this goal of wanting Republicans to go, you know, my God, those Democrats, they have such integrity. Good for them. They are really professional, which means they go to a gunfight with a knife.
I think you're right. And that is why I have been so grouchy and angry, because all of a sudden I know that I've been living in a bit of denial. You know, we
it ain't just a river, girl.
I hear you, son. But it's been hard because, you know, we lost and then we had this just in between period. You're like, okay, we'll see what happens. And it's happening. And right before it's happening, I'm watching these hearings. I was incensed.
If they don't have a wake-up call this week, days before Trump takes over, with these people being put forth for confirmation that we are in a fucking crisis, and they don't approach these hearings with the kind of aggression and gravity that is required, what are they going to wait for? When we're an autocracy, and we can't do it anymore?
Week? But the thing I would say is, yes, it's frustrating to watch the Democrats have really a poor line of questions and not coordinate. But in reality, stepping back, I don't let it frustrate me that much, because it's a foregone conclusion, the votes on these hearings. And as much as we may enjoy better questions, they make no difference in the end.
I don't agree. These senators, most of them are lawyers. Look at what Tim Kaine did again. They have to create that Perry Mason moment, and it rattles them. And this is the person you want in that chair? And
nobody's watching.
Well,
but you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, so as frustrated as I was this week. And
Oh, you've changed already, Jen?
no. But what I was hoping for, yes, I've changed because deep inside, I don't want to be this person. But what I was hoping for was...
Who do you want to be, Jen?
I want to be somebody who lives in a different time where Trump isn't going to be president next week. That's where I want to be.
I'll agree with that.
Marie Antoinette lived in a different time. Do you want to be her? She should have quit while she was ahead.
All right. Anyway, what I would really have liked was that moment that Andy is describing, because let people see his incompetence. Just because people aren't watching doesn't mean it's not picked up.
Who's going to see
They're
it, though?
picking up that Michelle Obama and Nancy Pelosi aren't going to the inauguration. Who the fuck cares? Maybe they could pick up something that would be relevant.
It's not.
They have to somehow get Joni Ernst to be embarrassed about supporting Pete Hegseth. This is a rape survivor, a woman who served in combat, and she's going to be voting for someone who's been accused of rape, who says women don't belong in combat.
Yeah, because
somehow this testimony should have made her go, fuck, I can't vote for this guy.
Yes.
And they're all smart enough to be able to do that. But they're playing a game. They're just... It's the way they've been for years.
I just think you both lost sight of one thing, that nothing matters. Joni Ernst is going
Listen,
to vote
Debbie,
for...
I don't subscribe to... I don't live in Downerville like you do.
They just want to get reelected. She is up for election next year. She no doubt got the phone calls that Elon is going to put $50 million into your opponent in the primary, and you're fucked. Do you want to get reelected or not?
We have seen people like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. I agree with you that the premise is that these people all want to get reelected. But man, if this isn't the time to say, fuck it, I'll go do something else. I am not going to turn our country over to an autocrat. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean,
embarrassing.
If she was going to do that, she should have started doing it sooner. And the reality is, she's done. If she were to vote against Hegseth, she's done.
It's shocking. It's shocking.
Agreed.
And it's going to be great to see what Susan Collins does.
She has to think a lot about it over the weekend.
Please.
And the last thing, we don't have to spend too much time on this, but Donald Trump named Sylvester Stallone, John Voight, and Mel Gibson, major A-listers.
Well, it's about time, for goodness sake.
As special envoys to Hollywood to bring back the glory days, to save Hollywood and bring back... First of all, Mel Gibson didn't even know he was being appointed. He read about it through Trump's tweet the same time you and I did. Now, just think about that for a second. Here's a guy that's been appointed to this special position in the U.S. government, and he doesn't even know about it. I ain't gonna say whether Sly Stallone knew about it, but maybe he didn't know about it either, you know? I like Trump, but I'll do what I gotta do, you know?
Did you eat?
What?
Did you eat?
Jew eat? No, that's Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's a fucking racist. Anti-Semite. Yeah, send him to Hollywood. They'll listen to him there because Lord knows there's no Jews in Hollywood.
No.
My God. You got to laugh about this one because this is fucking crazy.
I just wanted, maybe my geography is off, but they were named as special ambassadors. Is Hollywood another country or is it part of California?
I think it's envoy, special envoy.
No, it's ambassador. I just looked it up.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, that changes the whole thing then. I stand corrected. They're going to do a bang-up job. I don't know, personally, I don't know what the glory days are. I mean, what glory days is he talking about? Like when the studios own the actors and paid them nothing? Call me crazy, but I think that probably appeals to Trump a lot.
I think they want to bring back blackface.
You might be right.
And blacklisting.
So, like, we're going back
to blacklisting. Let's bring back the blacks.
The blacklisting, the blackface.
Yeah. There is some breaking news since we started this.
Oh, really?
Yes. I think we have to talk about the inauguration because
Charlton Heston is alive?
Breaking news. The breaking news is they have apparently decided it's going to be too cold Monday and they're going to bring it all indoors. So no more complaining about how big the crowd size is because there can't be a very big crowd.
Where?
It's too cold.
Mar-a-Lago?
We're doing it in the rotunda.
No, they're going to do part of it in the rotunda and part of the ceremonies are going to be in some stadium. I don't remember. But the big news is the Village People are coming back for this. Yep.
I gotta say, I still don't get the whole Village People thing with Trump. Like, does he know that this is the most iconic musical band in the gay community in the last 50 years? Does he have any sense of this?
If they're good enough for the Yankees,
does he understand what YMCA is about? Like, this is the strangest embrace of a song and a band by a conservative, homophobe, transphobe that I have ever seen in my life. Yeah, one of the comedians said this is going to be the first construction worker he's ever paid.
That's good.
Yeah, it's a genius.
That's pretty good.
Genius line.
That's pretty good. And Billy Ray Cyrus with Lee Greenwood are going to perform with the Liberty University Praise Choir.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I've said this before on this podcast several months back, and I'm going to say it again. Folks, go read the lyrics to Lee Greenwald's song, I'm Proud to Be an American, and then match it up to everything we know that Donald Trump intends for this country in the next 4 years and everything he's done to this country, and tell me why that song applies to him on any level. All right, let's get to our winners and losers.
My winner, President Biden, staying true to championing. My winner, President Biden, staying true to champion. Yeah, say the fucking.
Got it?
My winner.
Just say the word champion and then add ing to it.
My winner, President Biden, staying true to champion.
Ing. This is the best part of the show today.
We might have to leave all this in.
And Jen, in her former life, was a speech pathologist. The irony is delicious.
Champion. You'll have to come back to me. Just move along.
We're not editing this out. This stays.
That's a good thing.
This is classic.
Did you want to do your loser first, or you want me to do winners and losers?
My loser is going to be Jen for not being able to say the word championing.
Okay. I just can't. I'll try. Okay. My loser, the GOP control.
You want me to go while you compose yourself?
Go for it, Maggie.
No, my ribs.
Stop laughing for the audio.
Guess. All right. Go ahead, Maddie.
My loser this week, 2 weeks in a row, Mark Zuckerberg. He has managed to demean himself even more when he called for corporate masculinity and threw Sheryl Sandberg under the bus during a conversation apparently with Donald Trump. My winner is Michelle Obama for not being a hypocrite and skipping Trump's inauguration. I'm loving the outrage from the likes of Jesse Waters.
And for the record, whenever I think of the word masculinity, first image I get in my head is Mark Zuckerberg. So
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
All right, Jenna, you ready? Is it rolling, Bob? Bob Dylan fans are going to know that reference. No one else will. Special prize, if anyone can email what that's from, what I just said.
What did you just say?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it a Beatles reference?
I just said Bob Dylan.
Oh, I don't know. Like what part of
All right,
Bob
let's get back to
Dylan?
championing.
Okay. My winner.
Twice I said it right.
I just composed myself.
No more pressure now that I said it
You're welcome.
correctly twice.
Good. My winner, President Biden, staying true to championing the underdog with his series of executive orders this week, ranging from commuting the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders to forgiving another $150,000 of student debt. My loser, the GOP-controlled North Carolina Supreme Court, for blocking the certification of the Democrat as winner of this close high court race.
My loser, Senate Democrats, who overall played nice and thus failed miserably in this week's confirmation hearings. Just imagine if Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi were Democrats and with such controversial, dangerous backgrounds. And it was Senate Republicans who were questioning them. My winner, Donald Trump, who continues to demonstrate that he's the luckiest individual alive. And that gets us to the weekly rant. One of the things that struck me the most about this week's Senate confirmation hearings was when Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, acknowledged, quote, "I have failed in things in my life, and thankfully, I'm redeemed by my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ." So on the one hand, he takes great pride in admitting his allegedly past imperfections and indiscretions. But when presented with the claims of many former coworkers and people who knew him well, that he demonstrated behavior that was at best inappropriate and unethical, and at worst illegal and dangerous, he dismissed every single incident as, quote, anonymous false charges and, quote, a left-leaning smear campaign. So one of two things is clearly happening here. Either in his mind, there's massive denial and a huge disconnect between his admittedly reprehensible past behavior and those who claim to have witnessed it, or he's just blatantly lying, pulling from the same successful Trump playbook of deny, 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 while claiming it's all fake news and that he's just a poor little victim of a massive witch hunt and a rigged system. Are we really to believe that an adult frat boy who's admitted to being a raging alcoholic and philanderer was somehow not capable of sexually harassing women in the workplace, or assaulting them in hotel rooms, or coming to work drunk and being delinquent in his responsibilities? Maybe this defense is intended for the dumbed-down MAGA universe, and to give Trump's Senate sycophants the ammunition they need to confirm him. But the rest of us with even half a brain know damn well who Pete Hegseth is and the danger he represents to America and its national security. All right, let's get to Chris Cox. He is a senior scholar in residence at the University of California, Irvine, a Life Trustee of the University of Southern California, chair of the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee for Southern California and the Pacific, and a member of several nonprofit and for-profit boards. Between 2 decades as a practicing lawyer, he served as chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and senior associate counsel to President Ronald Reagan. He has written for Fortune, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Forbes, the Detroit News, the Denver Post, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and dozens of other publications. His new book is Woodrow Wilson, A Light Withdrawn. Chris, welcome into the back room.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, Andy.
So you have a new book out called Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Congratulations on that. My first question, you've been a lawyer, a congressman, a senior associate counsel to President Ronald Reagan. You chaired the Securities and Exchange Commission. Of all the subjects to write about, what brought you to Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president who served from 1913 to 1921?
Well, perhaps making the story even more complicated, what brought me to Woodrow Wilson was my longstanding interest in why it took so long for women to get the right to vote. When I was in law school, which is really when all of this started, the very first thing I wrote for the Harvard Law Review was about a U.S. Supreme Court case that, for the first time, applied the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to sex discrimination, what we now call gender discrimination. And that same year, in the summer, I went out to Los Angeles to summer clerk for a law firm, and I was staying with my grandmother in Santa Monica, and I asked her about what her experience was, gaining the vote, and what was the first presidential election she voted in, I asked her. And she looked at me sort of crosswise and said, 1920, that was the first time we could vote. And I realized what a foolish question that was. But it sort of made me think that here's this woman that I'm talking to that I've known, and she's an adult American, and she actually was denied the right to vote. How could this happen in the 20th century? Why did it take so long? And so after I left government, I practiced law for 12 years, and when I retired from my law firm, I turned to writing and research and so on, and I thought I would write about this topic. And all roads rather rapidly led me to Woodrow Wilson, particularly the final act of the suffrage drama. And so when Simon & Schuster bought the book, they said, why don't you make this into a full-blown biography of Woodrow Wilson and used the suffrage story as the framework to tell it. And that's an angle on Woodrow Wilson that had been overlooked for a whole century.
Yeah, and he did have controversial views on civil and voting rights with regard to women and minorities. And I want to peel that back a little bit with you in a second. But was there anything in his childhood and early years, in particular, let's say the Civil War, which helped explain the adult and the politician he eventually became?
Yes. He was very much influenced by his upbringing in the South. I would say that was the most important influence on his entire academic and political careers. He was born in Virginia. His family moved early on to Georgia. He was raised there until he was a teenager. Then they moved to South Carolina and then to North Carolina. And during these years, we had, as you say, first the Civil War and then the longer period of Reconstruction. And both of those left a big imprint on Woodrow Wilson. When he moved to South Carolina, Black men were given the right to vote. They were elected to the legislature, to Congress, and Woodrow Wilson and his family very much resented this. Wilson's father, who was a big influence on him, had been actually a Confederate officer. He was a chaplain with officer rank in the Confederate Army. He had conferred with Jefferson Davis in Richmond. He turned his churchyard, he was a minister, into an internment camp for Union soldiers on their way to Andersonville Prison. He had preached from his pulpit at his segregated church about God's plan, intending that slavery was good for both the enslaved and for the masters. And he had made similar remarks, sermons that he published about women's places in the home, and man is the head, and she should not involve herself in all of the discussions and outside of the home. Her job was religion and raising children. So this was Wilson's milieu that he grew up in. Following his time in the South, he eventually moved north, but he took these thoughts with him. He started out in college, actually, at Davidson, so he was still in the South. And after he went to the College of New Jersey, he would come home to the South during his academic breaks and vacations. And when he went to Johns Hopkins, he was in Baltimore, which is still below the Mason-Dixon line. And actually, if we want to get into that, his professors at Johns Hopkins were German-trained white supremacists and gave him, an adult dosage of this. So it carried through really his entire academic career after that.
So he opposed the 19th Amendment, also known as the Anthony Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. How and why was this consequential then, and perhaps even more so in subsequent decades?
Yes, well, so one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in telling this story was how much of the fight for women's suffrage had been waged before Woodrow Wilson even was born. And so by the time he arrives in Washington, the suffrage movement is at a tipping point. It's ready. And there is this very famous parade that took place on Pennsylvania Avenue the day before Wilson's inauguration, something totally unprecedented. And it was a welcome to him and put rather squarely to him what was the most pressing domestic issue for America at the time. He was interested in tariffs, and that's what he prioritized when he came in. But he wanted to get rid of the tariff and did so effectively. But he wanted nothing to do with women's suffrage at that point. As governor of New Jersey, he had been asked point blank by the press what he was going to do about it. Other states were granting women the right to vote at that point. And he said he was totally against it because of the disruption that it would create in the home. So that's where he was when he started as president. As time moved on, and he's really right in the thick of the moment when the country has decided, men in the country have decided they want to do this. He's holding back, pushing back, telling the visiting women's groups, we're just have to wait. We're not going to do this. He switched sort of in the middle of all of this discussion to no longer saying that he was opposed to women voting, but rather that he was willing to support states making the decisions for themselves. That sort of rings a bell these days. So it was a states' rights, the traditional Southern Democratic position at the time. He then voted in New Jersey in favor of that state's initiative to grant women the right to vote, albeit it failed, and his decision to do so came very, very late. The sponsors of it had asked for an endorsement that they could use in advertising and so on, and he held back and didn't say anything till the very end, and the endorsement didn't matter much at that point. But it was part of his gradual change. He never really got comfortable with the Anthony Amendment, which was a federal amendment which would have given women across the country the right to vote because of the federal enforcement piece. He was very deferential to Jim Crow. He had a cabinet who he had recruited who were, in the main, white supremacists. And when I use that term, it sounds very derogatory, but they describe themselves that way. And his supporters in Congress, the chairman of most of the congressional committees, Democrats controlled the House and the Senate at that time, and the Southern Democrats were the most senior because they were the ones who had been there the longest. And so all of his allies in the main were opposed to forcing women's suffrage on the South. And that's why he opposed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. There's one little tale I should tell about Wilson confessing that his states' rights position was not the real reason. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter was one of 4 Democratic women who met with Wilson in the run-up to the 1916 re-election for Woodrow Wilson. And he agreed to this meeting because he thought it was friendly Democratic women, and he was going to explain to them the politics of women's suffrage and why he was opposing the Anthony Amendment in 1916, notwithstanding that his Republican opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, was for it. And so Harriet Stanton Blatch asked him, will you ever support the Anthony Amendment? And he said, Mrs. Stanton, let me disabuse you of the notion that states' rights has anything to do with our position here. So the reason that neither I nor my party will support this amendment is the Negro question. And they discussed that for a bit, and she continued to push back. But he was very clear. He did not want to have the South. He mentioned 2 states where he said the blacks would preponderate. He didn't want them to lose their opportunity to have Jim Crow and prevent these voters from changing the balance of power there.
It's interesting the parallels to the situation we're in today with Trump. We're talking right now about race and race relations as well, flirtations with white supremacy. Interesting was that Wilson was a strong proponent of expanding the role and powers of the presidency. Speak to that a little bit, which also Trump, as we know, is threatening to.
Right. And I think, although there is that facial similarity, I think Wilson's reasons for what he did and his thinking about it very different than Trump's. So starting with Wilson's upbringing in the South, which we were talking about, he resented the fact that a domineering Republican Congress was forcing on the Democratic South black men voting. And he wrote about this as an adult. So we can perhaps infer from the circumstances what he thought when he was growing up in this environment, but we know to a certainty what he thought as a middle-aged man when he was a professor at Princeton and when he was president of Princeton. He published books, including A History of the American People, which has an entire volume on Reconstruction. And he was just very blunt about how this was designed to destroy the South and how Republicans were misguided. They were thinking that allowing black men to vote would improve things, and it would actually, be the complete destruction of society there. And he was very clear about the fact that the leading white men of the South should govern. So when he came up with his theory of government, and he first wrote about it in a very short paper as a senior at the College of New Jersey, and then subsequently in his first book, it was really reverse engineering what had happened. If Andrew Johnson had not had his vetoes overridden, then Reconstruction couldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had the Freedmen's Bureau, which Wilson did not like. He did not like providing welfare to all of these, recently freed enslaved people. And he certainly didn't like the fact that the men were allowed to vote. So the solution that he came up with was that the president should have extraordinary powers. The president should be able to have the chairs of all the committees in the Congress be members of his cabinet. Only members of his party would be able to introduce legislation, and the president himself would be able to have not just a negative role, a veto, but as he said, a positive role in creating the laws. So that would change things rather radically.
It's a pretty radical view.
Yeah. But when we think of it in terms of, how that system would have worked during Reconstruction, it would have, totally empowered Andrew Johnson to stop what the Congress was doing.
Right. And, again, we can see the connective tissue to today's politics, and the scenario you describe and write about is Donald Trump's dream, the consolidation of power at the executive. On some level, that's happened, has it not, with the co-opting of the Republican Congress?
Right now, we have just a paper-thin difference between the majority and the minority, really in both the House and the Senate. And if history is any guide, this is a president now with effectively his second term. And typically what happens at the midterm is that there's the tide comes back the other way, or if you will, the wave in the bathtub, comes back. And so it is entirely predictable that Democrats have the majority in just 2 years, less than that. And that would change things radically. But even in the meantime, because the Republicans really can't afford to lose a single vote, they've got to work across the aisle on anything of major importance. So the system of checks and balances is not lost to us. And of course, we still have an independent judiciary. There's a lot of talk about, who got to appoint more judges, and are the judges all partisan, and so on. But there have been plenty of occasions where we've seen Trump lose in court. And so that will continue to be the case. We'll have, for the most part, an independent judiciary. And so the fact that the president does not control Congress, the fact that his party may not control Congress, there's still a lot of safeguards, I think, to one man, deciding he's taking over everything.
Another similarity between Wilson and Trump to me is, this week we've seen the Senate confirmation hearings of Pam Bondi, Trump's nominee for Attorney General, and others. A major concern about this incoming administration is the potential weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI against Trump's opponents and his perceived enemies. Describe the punishing and often brutal weaponization that was commonplace in the Wilson administration, especially involving critics of his position on the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, this is very instructive history because, there's a temptation to say to ourselves, well, that could never happen, or it's not going to be as bad as people are saying. People wouldn't do that because it has happened, and it's happened worse than most people recognize or imagine. The violation of what we now consider to be established norms of civil liberties at the time of Wilson's presidency, the second term in particular, it's just extraordinary. So Wilson got reelected as the peace candidate in 1916. Rather famously, he kept us out of war. That was the mantra at the Democratic Convention that year, and then it showed up on all the campaign buttons and so on. But there was also a lot of negative advertising. against Hughes. If you want war, vote for Hughes. Hughes had not taken that position, but there were pictures of mothers with sons bleeding and so on. Say, if you want one ad in the newspaper said, if you want your son to go to hell, vote for Hughes. So this was a very anti-war campaign in 1916. And there were a lot of people on the left who were pacifists and supporters of Wilson for that reason. When he, very shortly after his inauguration, asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, these people were immediately disillusioned, and they came to Washington. They wanted to protest. And Wilson, who at the time had the opportunity to exert plenary control over the D.C. government, did so, especially through two appointees of his who had been longtime supporters, journalists who had actually advised him during his campaign and so on. They were vice chairs, I think, of his inaugural committee. So he was on, regular speaking terms with them, not anything like what we're accustomed to with the management of D.C. today. So the police, the prosecutors, the jails, the jail hospitals, all of these things are effectively under Wilson's direct control. And we find that, first of all, they shut down all the opportunities to demonstrate. There should be no protests or what have you in the city of Washington. And this was in part to tamp down resistance to the draft. We hadn't had a draft since the Civil War, and Wilson, the historian, remembered the draft riots, so we're having none of that. But beyond that, he wanted to censor all of the reporting about the government because we were at war and everything was different. He said the First Amendment has to go. He told that privately to a journalist at the New York World. And he created something called the Committee on Public Information. It was both a censorship operation, ended up having 150,000 staff and volunteers. But besides censoring with the power of the Espionage Act that he signed behind it, including the death penalty and harsh prison terms and all that sort of thing, for embarrassing the government in anything that you say, he also used the Committee on Public Information to put out massive volumes of propaganda. And the propaganda was used with respect to the suffragists to turn them into militants, even though they were, silently protesting, holding up banners, mostly with his own speeches quoted about democracy. And then they, of course, were imprisoned, on trumped-up charges for sidewalk obstruction. There's a 40-foot sidewalk in front of the White House. People that have visited Washington can see and imagine. And at a time when there was no jet travel and so on, very little pedestrian traffic, these women are up against the fence. There's lots of room to go by. There were photographs taken, at the time of their first arrests of an empty sidewalk. And notwithstanding that, they get convicted of the misdemeanor of sidewalk obstruction. These arrests and convictions continued, and the sentences got longer when the women kept coming back. And so to make sure the women really understood that the government meant business, it eventually turned into, sentences of more than half a year. Alice Paul, famously, 7 months because she was a leader. Lucy Burns, same thing. So once they are in the Occoquan workhouse and the district jail, there's physical abuse and serious physical abuse for these women. Some of them, nearly dying from it. And it's just a horrible story, but a horrible thing in our history. Alice Paul was, in addition, put in the psychiatric ward. They accused her of being insane and having a complex that she was after Wilson and so on. And she was, of course, always very well spoken and compos mentis. And this was really an excuse to force feed her because at the time, and she went on a hunger strike, not because of her own conditions, but because people were being denied access to their lawyers. They were being denied access to their doctors, to their own prescription medicines. to decent nutrition that the murderers in prison got, and so on. But in order to force feed her, it was a very dangerous procedure at the time. People could die from it almost at the same time they were being fed, because the fat tubes that they were using without anesthesia would sometimes rip their organs or would decant into their lungs, and they'd quickly get pneumonia, and that would be it. So it was a very dangerous, potentially lethal procedure, and it was almost never performed without the consent of the patient. And when it was an unwilling patient, you needed to establish that they were insane. And so that's part of what Wilson himself was involved in. He ultimately blessed the decision to go forward with this in Alice Paul's case.
Was there something that you were surprised to learn about Wilson in researching and writing the book?
Oh my goodness. My research, covered a decade and a half, nearly 14 years.
Wow.
And I changed my conception of Woodrow Wilson almost from day to day. During that period, I would keep discovering new things. He's a very complicated man, and his contradictions are pretty evident to us today. He's remembered as a leader of the progressive movement, and yet he was also a white supremacist and
Cruel.
the way of the anti-movement.
Cruelty.
So
Yeah.
the cruelty came about more markedly. Well, maybe it wasn't even there before, but in his second term. In the second term, when he became a war president, perhaps because World War I itself was so violent and awful, he had to make decisions like authorizing the United States to produce the gas warfare material that today are Geneva Convention violations. It's very easy to see the change in him. He became very hardened, and then of course he left the country after the war for 6 months. A lot of attention is paid to the fact that Wilson had a stroke after that, and that he was essentially an absentee president during that period until the end of his term. But immediately prior, he had been in Europe, and at a time when there was almost no decent transatlantic communication. There was Morse code that you could send through the undersea cable, but that required encoding it and decoding it at both ends. So he couldn't do long documents. He didn't get newspapers. He didn't have much contact even with his own cabinet, let alone members of Congress. And he was entirely focused on what he was doing in Paris, which was he had appointed himself the lead U.S. negotiator. That had never been done for obvious reasons. But no president had ever left the country for more than a few days, and never while Congress is in session. When Congress passes a bill, it becomes law by presenting it to the president. And they couldn't present their bills to the president because he wasn't there. He decided that all of that could wait till he returned. Meantime, the country was facing, it was post-war time, and a lot of things had been nationalized during the war, and there was nothing to unravel it. So we had, runaway inflation, we had race riots, we had labor disputes, and Wilson was just oblivious to all of this. So the stubbornness, and as you say, maybe even the cruelty that he had become capable of in his second term manifested itself in this other way as well. He was monomaniacally focused on one thing and told everybody who wanted him to pay attention to something else, including all of his Democratic supporters in Congress, that they should just pipe down. And it did not work out well for him in the end.
The latest Siena College Research Institute survey of 141 presidential historians ranked Wilson at 13th out of the 46 U.S. presidents, which seems unfathomable given what we're discussing. In your opinion, is this a fair and accurate judgment of him?
It's amazing to me that after all the time I've spent with Woodrow Wilson, I can't answer that question, because what Wilson is highly regarded for is a whole separate set of things from the things that I've written about. And the reason I wrote about them, of course, is that they hadn't been written about very much, and they hadn't been explored in any depth in any popular biography. But the problems that are highlighted in Wilson's approach to race and to women's voting rights are issues of human rights, and denying Americans their human rights is fairly fundamental. On the other hand, a lot of his accomplishments, signing the Clayton Act, signing the first income tax, creating the first agencies of the administrative state, and even, being a wartime president, those things are qualitatively different. So I don't know, if you have to turn this into a ranking, how you score it. What do you get? -1 human rights points for one improvement in the structure of government, or how does that work? And it's just apples and oranges. So it adds, for me, to the complexity of this man, which is what makes him so interesting.
Well, to your point, it speaks to the challenges and the complexities of the office, and therefore the man who occupied that office, which I guess does render these rankings a little bit silly when you think about it.
Well, one of the things that struck me is that when Arthur Schlesinger, started this business of ranking presidents in Life magazine, and in the debut ranking, Wilson fared very well. He had Ulysses Grant last, or near last. He was He was rated a failure, and Ulysses Grant, of course, gave us the Justice Department, gave us the Ku Klux Klan Act, gave us Reconstruction. He was Wilson's opposite on these very issues. So times change. I think for that reason, Grant's standing is improving. But people did not pay that much attention to being wrong on race, as it were, even in the 50s.
The book, again, is Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Chris, continue good luck with that. Thanks for coming on. And I would love to have you come back because given your congressional experience and running the SEC and all the oligarchy issues we're dealing with, there's so much more to talk about beyond Woodrow Wilson, and I would love to have that conversation with you at some point soon.
Well, that would be very fun, as this was. Thanks so much.
Thanks again.
Okay, bye now.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.